Very early. I don't know, maybe I'm 3 years old or something.
Here, go ahead and tell me more.
Oh, you're waiting for me. I'm sorry. What do I do? Just kind of freelance?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I kind of try to organize my thoughts, and I tell you that Piermont, my early memories of Piermont were that it was a self-contained, a self-sustaining community for us. And by that I mean that Piermont, in its 1.5 block, I guess you'd call it, Main Street, which is what we call Piermont Avenue, had a diner. It had several shoe repair places, several hair cutting places. It had a bakery. It had a drugstore. It had a lawyer's office. This is all on Main Street. And it had a plumber who had a little hardware store, Mr. Payne. It had a pool hall next to one of the barber shops, and it had grocery stores. There were at least 3 of them, and the biggest one was what is now Community Market. That was owned by a Slovak family, the Ripples, and there was another meat store farther up on Main Street. I forget the name of that place. And at the, I don't know what's north, at the south end of the village, there was a railroad, a freight railroad that ran to the mill. There were, in effect, the major groups of ethnicity were the Irish, the Italians, the Slovaks, and then there were what we considered the English, but I don't really know if they were English or Dutch or German or what. It was another conglomeration of people. There was a fire. Well, of course, the village Piermont was always a independent village, so it had its own government, mayor, trustees, had its own fire department. It had its own what we call garbage and street cleaning people, what is now the DPW. It had a doctor. It had 4 churches, I believe. It was St. John's, which was on the Grandview line, is still there, Catholic church. Then there was a Methodist church farther south. And I don't know what happened to that church. It either burned down or it was taken down. And the 3rd one was a colored church for colored people. That was opposite the present fire department. We had a fire department in Piermont. Let's see, who am I missing now? I think that's it. Did I mention drugstore? Yes. Oh, Herman's department store. That I remember. Oh, and the cleaners and tailors. Did I mention a bakery?
No, you didn't.
Okay.
What do you remember?
Pardon?
What do you remember of the bakery?
Oh, the good stuff.
Like what?
Buns and all kinds of pastries. And it was called, if I remember correctly, Gerlach. So that sounds German. What was I now? Oh, the train tracks. Yes, I must tell you about the train tracks. They were down by what is now, I believe, Tate Avenue, and it ran right across what is Main Street, Piermont Avenue, into the mill. That's the other thing. The major industries in town were the mill, which was Robert Gare Company. It consisted of, I think, 3 separate operations. One was the making of cardboard for boxes. It was called the box shop in many ways. Then they made the boxes there. And then there was an egg safety department, which I presume they made egg boxes. I grew up on the corner of Ash Street and Kinney Street. And Kinney Street ran down to Main Street. So that was a connection that this block and a half, Main Street, that I'm talking about. The industries were, of course, the mill. There was Comfort Coal down where now the DPW is. I believe the building's still there. There was a silk mill on Fredonia Avenue, which is now an apartment house and formerly was called Haddock Hall. Before that, it made silk ribbons, as I understand it. And then when World War II came, it made parachute straps. And then there was a fourth industry, which was the fishing on the river. Every March, whoever had the nets and the poles would be putting it out, no matter how cold or whether the river was icing or not. And I believe that they shipped most of their fish down to the tip. The institutions, of course, were the church, the village, municipal. Then we had fire department. Also, the school was an institution. And the village government. I think that's the best I remember. Oh, and a post office. We had a post office. I mustn't forget that. We did not have mail delivery, so we had to go down to the post office to pick up our mail. Yeah. And since we lived on Ash Street, it was delivered by the railroad, and a man with a wheelbarrow carried the mail sacks down to the post office and then back up to the train. That was carried out several times a day, as I remember. And some of the boys from the high school helped that man on their lunch hour. So I don't know what the schedule was. But as children, we were the gophers of the family at a very early age. We went into all the stores, drugstore, post office was our place. We had a box there, and we got our deliveries twice. I mean, we didn't get our deliveries. We went down to pick up the mail twice a day. And there was a lot of mail because I grew up in an extended family of uncles and aunts and grandmother. And my mother and I lost my father when I was 2 years old. So we lived with my grandmother's family and her brothers and sisters. My mother's brothers and sisters. I was born in the Nyack Hospital. Probably the first one in my immigrant family that was born in a hospital. They had midwives in those days. Probably still do. That was 94 years ago.
Wow.
When Nyack Hospital was a one-building hospital. Having a large family that we did, we spent a lot of time in the hospital with all kinds of illnesses and whatnot. The doctor came to the house, Dr. Leitner, and carried out what we could, and when we didn't, then we had to go to the hospital. But the miraculous thing that I remember most is that we always had a car. And my first memory of a car, it was a family car. That you had to crank it up. How do I describe it? You're pretty young, so maybe you wouldn't have any vision of this, but you had to put something into it looked like the bottom of the radiator on the outside, and you cranked up the car.
Wow.
And then the other cars were regular cars. We lived among us on the hill. People called us, the Vermonters called us the people on the hill. Well, you either lived on the hill or you lived by the river. So those were the two separations. We had sounds that kind of ordered our lives. That sounds very strange. But the mill blew its whistles. I guess they were steam whistles at that time. They weren't sirens that I remember. And at regular intervals. Now, my uncles who worked in the mill had shifts. I think it was 7 in the morning to 3, and then 3 to 11. And maybe even there was a night shift when the war came, 11 to 7. But then everything was turned over to the war after Second World War, I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so those whistles guided us. And the one I remember best is that when we went to school, we came home for lunch because we could walk. Our school consisted of 2 buildings on Hudson Terrace, one of which still stands. And we could come home for lunch because we also had chores to do, like go to the store or do something else. As children, we just picked up responsibilities of the house as it came due to us. And the 1 o'clock whistle was the one that we knew we had to be back in school by. In addition to that, very early memories were that the train service was very, very frequent, much more so than when I started to commute. And so we were guided by the trains, too, whistles. Because we lived right below where the train station was. We could walk to the train station, too. We didn't use the train station very much, because we walked everywhere. And we had a car. School was paramount in our lives, and we could walk to it. We had one, now that I look back on it, this little village supported a school When I graduated high school, there were 20 of us. We were almost considered a private school these days. We had wonderful teachers. The buildings in Piermont, there were 2 buildings in Piermont, and then there was one that belonged to our district. We called it Spark Hill, but it was off the 9W. So I think that was still Piermont proper. And we accessed that school because it had stage and it had an auditorium, which our 2 buildings in Piermont did not have. And you accessed the school by going down a tunnel under the 9W into the schoolyard in Spark Hill. We had wonderful teachers. I loved school. It was the highlight of my day. When we went to school, that is. And we had a nurse that took care of us. Our inoculations, whatever we needed at that point in time, which weren't very many. The Dr. Whitener came to the school and inoculated us. We didn't have to go anywhere. It had a gymnasium, though. One of the buildings had a gymnasium. And assemblies were held there for whatever grades were assembling for music concert or an art or whatever we had at those days. And it served as, and was part of the gym. So there were often athletic things there. But a lot of these high schools, as I understand it, wouldn't play basketball in our gym because it wasn't regulation size. Probably was too small. We had a big schoolyard where recess was held. In the big building which housed the 4th grade through the high school, there was the boys section and the girls section, where you gathered before you were told to come up to class. There was a science lab there, and the high school was on the, what would be considered now the 3rd floor, but actually we considered it the 2nd floor because the 1st floor was where we gathered for class, where the lockers were and the bathroom facilities. And it was separated by a boys section on one side of the building and a girls section on the other side. And in the middle, separating these two, was a very big space with the heating and whatnot that went on through the custodial stuff. The 2nd floor, what I consider the 2nd floor as a high school part, was where it was a marvel because the classrooms were built around that big hall, and in the middle it was there was a railing in the middle, a round railing, and it had it looked like windows in the floor. I guess it was part of the ventilation system, and so you could look down through this. That was always a fascinating experience. It was a beautiful building. We had a full education, I considered, this little place. And once I came across several years ago a picture of my uncle, he was the youngest uncle, must have been in high school at that point in time, and he was standing outside of the school in his basketball uniform, along with its teammates. And one of his teammates was Lenny Cook. Since you're from Niles, you know Lenny Cook.
Very well.
NAACP?
He actually he got my father's job when my father was laid off from Curtis Wright in Lodi, New Jersey after 32 years.
Oh, yeah.
Lenny Cook got him a job at the Nyack Water.
Well, everybody is familiar with him, but that point in time, which must have been in the 1930s, late 1920s, maybe. So my point being that not only did we have a colored church, we had colored neighbors, we went to school with colored people. They were our neighbors, that's all. That's the only point I wish to make that this whole thing. Church was a very, very big part of our lives. Everybody went to church. Hold on. Come in. I'm sorry, there's someone at my door.
Keep your tongue.
Oh, thank you very much, Frank. Thanks. Sorry. Okay. Very nice. A very nice superintendent here who helped me out pretty much.
Very kind of him. So you were talking about church life.
About what?
Church life.
Oh, church, yes. Okay, everybody went to church in all the churches that I mentioned. Everybody was there and full there. We had, I forgot to mention, but this is important. My first memories of our police department was one policeman. His name was Gene Dio. He rode in a motorcycle with a sidecar. We were deathly afraid of him. He carried a billy club. He was the only policeman in town. And the churches, as they held their services, this traffic, whatever it was, however little it was then, was directed by his successors, Eugene Dale's successors. Whether there were one or two at that time, I can't remember. But these are like in our memory that I'm describing to you now is like early teenage years.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody went to church, and children were all over the place. We had, every family had a large number of children. So we had lots of friends. In church, there was so many things in church that it would keep you occupied all day long, every day. We were in the choir. There were processions all the time, church services of all kinds. We were in Sunday school, and we eventually taught Sunday school. When we were teenagers in high school, we collected flowers for the altar and decorated the altar. People grew flowers for the churches. Well, at least for our church. I can't speak for others, but no doubt the same thing happened to the others. So that was a big thing. And there were fundraisers all the time, of course. And belonging to St. John's, if you're familiar with it now, it looks a lot different because it burned down in 1962. And it was reconstructed in a different format than it was when I was growing up. there was a lot more grass around, and the cars all parked on the street. So that's why the policeman, I guess, was there to direct the traffic, because there was no parking lots. It was all grass and whatnot. And the fundraisers were out there. They had tea parties. They had, it was like carnival. And we grew up with parades of all kinds. Every civic holiday was marked by celebration, with 10-month celebration. And there were bands. I don't know where the bands all came from. And the firemen marched, and whatever else, all the municipal people, we were Girl Scouts. We marched in all of those parades, too. And there were regular carnivals. And the Italian Society had what they called a Cosmos and Damien Society, where they marched from the church down to the village, and then they had a carnival. And the carnivals lasted about a week, as did the ones that the firemen had. And they were all followed by a last night of fireworks. So there were always fireworks that we could look forward to. And parades, I think. And now that I look back on it, in our neighborhood, everybody displayed flags on their porches. Most houses had porches in those days. There was no air conditioning. I can remember when we didn't have a phone and we didn't have a refrigerator. We had an icebox out on the back porch. And so we got regular deliveries of ice. And the iceman knew exactly how much to leave before he had to come back. And we never locked the doors on our homes or our cars. So we had regular people delivering, and often the Iceman would come in and help himself to coffee and cake, because we always had that around. My grandmother was always around. And there were other people that just came to stop by and have coffee and cake. And we had deliveries of ice. We had deliveries of the Nyack Journal, which is now the Journal News, but it was the Nyack paper then. And whatever his successors were. We had butter and eggs delivered. We had coal and wood delivered, because our home was heated by a behemoth furnace down in what we call the cellar, which had to be accessed from the outside of the house. There were 3 coal bins there, and so we got our coal mostly from the Nyack Ice and Coal Company. I don't know if it still exists, probably not.
No.
And what else did we have? I don't know, but there were peddlers that came around too. One with a horse, and he parked on Ash Street, and he was selling to all of the homes, I guess, made several stops, textiles, like for sheets and pillowcases. Dresser scarves were always very big. And then there was vegetables too, but we didn't do that very much because we had access to all the farms that were there in Global and Orangeburg and whatnot, because all that was farmland before Camp Jackson. And we got a lot of our vegetables there, strawberries, and in the winter we would come home with, we had a car so we could get to the farm. And the sacks of potatoes that lasted us all winter down in this cellar that I'm describing to you. And we finally, of course, got a phone. We didn't have a phone either, but I believe that when I was very small, there was a phone booth at the bottom of Ash Street. And that's probably where we had to call the doctor or something, where we had to contact someone. Because I remember that we didn't have a phone for a long time. At least to me, it seemed like a long time. And we didn't have a refrigerator, which I mentioned already. Sorry to repeat.
No.
But we always had a lot of food. The best thing I remember, we learned how to stoke the furnace. I mean, we were expected to do chores as we grew up. It just was natural. Everybody contributed to the household until they got married and went off. The summer, of course, we had cold. Well, in the winter we had cold deliveries. So, but in the summer there were wood deliveries. I can't remember where they came from, but it was the summertime of cutting wood, splitting it in one knot into, because you had to start the coal fire with wood. That was a family effort. Men and women. What was also ubiquitous in this whole area that I grew up with were clotheslines, because we didn't have washers and dryers. So everybody had a bunch of clotheslines, and in the winter, it was a chore, because nothing ever dried on the lines, it just got stiff. So you had to bring it in, and in our house, we had this behemoth of a furnace, heated floor registers in each room. You know what I'm trying to describe?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
The behemoth of a
That's what I'm calling them. I don't know what they were really called.
Perfect word. You're a wonderful storyteller. Mildred, keep going.
So we would bring in all of these frozen clothes from the line. And remember, the lines had to be put up quite high because you couldn't let the sheep flow on the, in the yard or on the sidewalk. So what we did is we brought them in, and we put chairs around these floor registers and put the clothes on till they melted, and then they finally melted. I don't mean that. They got, they were dry and, well, that's not proper. They got to the point where it was the second part of the winter drying. In the summer, they all dried on the clothesline, but no problem. Mm-hmm. But in the winter, you had to do this two-process thing and then get them dried out by these registers. But that was not unique to our house. But I'm sure the clotheslines were what I remembered suddenly. We learned there were all kinds of things that you had to do with these clotheslines, because you had to pull them in, you had to push them, you had to go out to big poles where they were out in the yard in our house. And you had all kinds of clothespins and pulleys and whatever else you had to make sure the lines didn't break on you. And they were put together anyway. We learned how to do that too. And we had, let's see now, what else? Oh, well, of course, we had a front porch, and we had a back porch, and we had a side porch. At one point in time, probably there was a wraparound porch. Because there was one section that was not porched off that was probably made into extra bedrooms or something. After all, we did have a big household. And the front porch fronted on Ash Street. And also, Ash, we had a big porch. There was a picket fence around it. And we learned how to paint that fence. That was our chore when we were children, really. We just paint the picket fence. You know how hard it is to paint a picket fence? You have to go on two sides in between.
Huckleberry Finn knows how hard it is.
So, yeah, maybe. That's a good analogy. And we had 3 apple trees out in the front, which didn't do very well. I don't know who planted the trees, whether it was our grandparents or their owners of the house before them. I don't know. But these apple trees became our Saturday chore because we had to sweep up and rake all of the stuff that came down. In addition, of course, there were trees all over the place. They always had leaves to sweep up and twigs and whatnot. Wind always blew. Hurricanes we had. So every Saturday that was our chore. And it was a little easier than it would be today because we could burn the leaves and the twigs or whatever else accumulated during the week there, right out in the road under the thing. Now, of course, that stopped after a while. There was some kind of a prohibition against that, which made sense. But children went everywhere. I'll tell you that we went to weddings, we went to funerals, we were, of course, in parades, we went to carnivals. We went to fundraisers of all kinds. We went to something called penny sales. I don't know if they still have them these days. I doubt it. But that's exactly what they were. We brought our pennies, especially in the firehouse, because the firehouse was not far from our house off Kinney Street. And they would have fundraisers, and you put your pennies in a can, or I don't know how it worked, but anyway, you got a prize, or whatever prize you wanted. You didn't have to bid on all of them, so we went there often because 2 of my uncles were firemen, so naturally we had to support it. What else was I going to say now? Old school, I must tell. Oh no, did I tell you our churches were all right? I gave you a pretty good summary, I think, of the church life.
What did you work in any of the industries in Vermont?
No, I commuted. I graduated in one day, and the next day I was on the Erie Railroad train from Piermont to Jersey City to go to work in the city. My godmother had gotten me a job in a New York life insurance company where I worked for 40 years before I retired. And that's where I'll tell you my railroad stories. Because in the beginning, we took the train. And the train, by the time it was 1944. So in 1944, the train service has diminished to 3 in the morning and 3 at night. And I think there was a freight line that went through, too. So we started out commuting on the train to Jersey City. And the trains were steam driven. So they would come around, they start in Nyack and go down to Jersey City. So we were like the third step. Well, Nyack was the first. I don't know if you had a station in South Nyack, but you had one in Grandview, I know. And then in Piermont, and in Sparkhill, and then it went to Jersey, to all the towns through Jersey, till it got to Jersey City. So this big steaming hulk of an engine came around the corner where we couldn't see, and we many times had to run to catch the train because, the nearer you live to a place, the later you get there. And of course the trains were not air conditioned, so in the summertime, which is when that started, well, you went to the city with hat and gloves and shoes and everything that matched. Not that we had that much, but you certainly put on your best to get to the city. By the time you got home, all these white gloves and your dress were full of soot from the stuff that blew back from the engine because you had to open the windows, otherwise you'd suffocate in the cars. And in the winter, there were times when I remember there wasn't much heat, so maybe it was the waning days of the railroad, so no doubt, like everything else, it kind of went downhill a little bit. But it was a nice ride. The other thing that I wanted to remember for what's her name? Yield? Oh, I've just forgotten her name. Your friend, my friend, who got me into this project.
Lola.
I said, make sure you put that story in there and any others. So the others that I thought about were, we knew when we were approaching Secaucus because you didn't have to have the conductor, announce that because you smelled it. The slaughterhouses were Secaucus. And so we were greeted every morning by that smell. The other thing that I remember is in Piermont, there was a piece of track. Piermont is like built on cliffs and whatnot. So there was a piece of track that went very, very near the edge of the cliff. So I tried to avoid sitting on that side of the train because it wasn't a very big piece of track, but it was enough to scare you. And I think at one point in time it did go off the track there. Not in my time. I mean, after my time, let me say that. Because we had to stop using the train because it got us in too late to work. So we switched the buses. So instead of going up the hill, we went down the hill to catch the bus. It was a harder commute in a way because it left us off on the west side and our company was on the east side of New York. And we had a trip that way through Madison Square Park. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Mm-hmm. That's right where you're building, right in the New York Life.
Pardon?
That's where the New York Life building is, right?
That's right. It's off Madison Avenue. Madison Square Park, 26th and Madison. Did you ever work there?
No, but I know that part of the city.
Oh, okay.
For 40 years, that's a career.
Yes, it was. I was 17 when I graduated, and I had to have working papers in those days. I don't know, because I wasn't 18. I don't know if you still have to do that or not.
Yeah, you do. You do get started.
And don't ask me how I got them, but I got them. And the other thing I wanted to remember and put in this narrative was the fact that the Slovak families were quite abundant in Piermont, along with the Italian families and the Irish families. And we lived on Ash Street, but Ash Street was like a series of levels. You must know it now. And the top of the level was 9W, where Ash Street met 9W. Mm-hmm. And right now there are a lot of houses up there and everything. But when we were growing up, when I speak of we, I'm sorry, I probably forgot to tell you that that was my cousin and I grew up as sisters in the same household. So we were only a year and a half apart. So we really got very close. We were sisters. And so we went everywhere. When I say we as a child, that's who we consisted of many times, with the two of us, as we made our way through life here. But anyway, what I wanted to tell you is that Upper Ash Street, what you would consider Upper Ash Street now, is full of home developers came afterward and whatnot. And between the station, the railroad station, and 9W, were very few homes in that era that I'm talking about. And it was open space, and one of the open spaces was a very big one. And the Slovaks families, it was owned by I guess one of the Slovak families. At least once a year in the summertime, they would have all the Slovak families gather in this large, what we call picnic space. And they had a picnic at least once a year, maybe it was twice a year. The men played baseball. That's how large it was. I don't know if it was regulation or just one of those other things. I can't remember that. But as children, we would look forward to that. Meeting all the children and all the families to get together. I don't know who hosted this thing, but there were tubs and tubs of corn on the cob and all kinds of food and a great gathering. So when I started off saying that Piermont was a self-sustaining place, well, it was a communal place for everyone, not just one group of people.
Did everybody get along?
Well, as children, I don't know. I can't. I'm not sure. But by today's standards, I think human nature, is that not everybody gets along, but you tolerate it. But that's just a childhood, that's not a childhood. That's my present position on this thing. I don't know if they all tolerate it. Coming from a large family, not everything went a little smoothly, so I guess you'd say the same thing about the community. Another thing about the community, Piermont itself, was that every time they had an election, which I don't know, was 2 years or 3 years, changing the mayor. And the mayor didn't change very much, or the trustees. But they had a parade, just a kind of parade afterwards, and so we got to know who won that night. We didn't have to wait for the paper to come to tell us, and probably wouldn't have told us for 2 days or so. So that was another event that happened. I guess what I'm trying to describe is that what I grew up with in Piermont was the time before World War II. I was in high school, 1941. I was a freshman, so prior to that is what I'm just trying to describe to you as our growing up days, because it started to change with Camp Chase coming. It wasn't the bridge or whatnot. It was Camp Shanks that started it all. And the draft, because suddenly this self-sustaining, self-communal, self-contained village, its men were drafted into the war. And that's when the real changes started. We sat as high schoolers down by the post office. I don't know if you know where the post office is now in Piermont, but it was a route while the soldiers from Camp Shanks were marched to the pier to go on what we call the Sandy Hook boats, which are simply like ferries down to the ocean line, where they crossed the ocean to go to war in Europe. And then they were these mournful, we were, all our lives, I can remember, even well into adulthood, hearing the West Shore Railroad. That, it was in Tappan. It's still there, isn't it? Freight.
I think so.
I don't think they have commuter trains anymore, but I'm not sure. But anyway, at night, they would be mournful sounds. I guess they will reverberate off the mountains in Piermont. But just think, when I remember that now, we would lie in bed and hear these mournful train sounds. And the reason I guess I remember it is my uncle, one of my uncles, well, two of my uncles were drafted, but one of them went to Normandy via Camp Shanks, but he went on the train, so he must have gotten the West Shore at that point in time, because there was no Erie Railroad then, or at least I don't think what it was. Well, that's a little stray, but that's a little farther, in life too. But it's an interesting point where you suddenly find out that the world is not a safe place anymore. Things change too much very quickly for us in Piermont. But in high school, we thought it was an adventure. And I didn't know any of the soldiers that marched. They marched in full gear from Camp Shanks. I don't know, that's a long ways, really. But then they marched through Europe and Africa, so it was nothing for them, I guess. But anyway, we sat there by the hour while they went and waved to them and threw candy or something that we had at them, and they were in their full gear out to the pier. Now, the pier was not opened to us as children because that was part of the mill, at least not to us. But we were always crossing the river. My first recollection is a ferry in Piermont. We got on it. Remember, we had a car. It was a car ferry. And we were constantly crossing the river to where my grandmother's and my mother's friends were, in Tarrytown, and Hastings, and all of those. I don't know how they had all these friends over there, but anyway, ferries were another part of our life. When the Piermont ferry, and I was very small, maybe I was 3, and you asked for one of my first memories. Maybe that's one of my first memories. It really scared me to death to go across the river at that young life part of my life. Because, if you were the first car on the ferry, that was a very good sight for a 3-year-old. You might slide off into the river.
Wow.
But then we went to Nyack. Nyack ferry ran for a while, and then it became a yacht. And my aunt married into one of those Westchester families, so we were constantly going back and forth, and we spent a lot of time there. And we rode all these ferries. When the Nyack ferry stopped, then we went to Yonkers ferry. because then they were coming over here too. So it was, I'm not going to say it was a commute, but it was very often. And of course, when we learned to drive, then that became a little easier. But ferries were always a part of our lives. And the river was always a part of our life. It still is. It's my Hudson River. I live in Nanuet, but it's my Hudson River. Because we could see it from our house. Because it was perched on top of Ash Street and Kinney. And Kinney Street, when we were growing up, I must say that our house was on the top of Kinney Street and Ash at the juncture there. And then down Kinney Street, there was an old shack that we remember that nobody lived in. And then there was the bottom of Kinney Street where there was a cluster of homes. So we had Kinney Street practically to ourselves as a playground. And that was interesting because what I remember is that one of the most delightful things we did was take a jar, a clear jar, and starting at twilight time, and go outside and catch all the lightning bolts and put them in this jar, and then release them all. And we had fuzzy caterpillars that turned into butterflies. And being very small, very seldom did we hear an airplane. So when we heard an airplane, we all ran outside, tried to figure out where it was. It made a lot of noise because there were no jet planes in it or anything like that.
Yes, there were.
We were just amazed at how an airplane could stay in the sky. So that was another piece of it. Then we gathered raspberries. There were bushes, raspberry bushes and blackberry bushes along Kinney Street and up further where I described this picnic area was. And we would also gather violets. There were a lot of violet fields. And we would bring the violets home or to church and put them in church. Doesn't sound like very important, but it, kept us occupied and interested. We could swing from broken limbs, not broken, but hanging limbs from the trees on Kinney Street. We didn't like that. My family didn't like that very much. We were discouraged from doing that. But we had a garage for the car. And underneath the garage was a big shed area with, I'm going to describe it, with different levels. In other words, we were on top of the hill, so naturally some of the space was narrower than the other, not only narrower, but less in height. So it's different levels is what I'm trying to describe. And what emptied into our shed that I'm talking about, emptied into our backyard. And so it became our summer playhouse. It was big enough there in the front, or rather the backyard part, where we could have like almost 2 rooms, not very large, but we managed to have 2 rooms, one for my husband and one for myself, where we had our plaything in the summertime. And in the back of the shed was the amazing part, because it was filled with tools of all kinds, and what looked like wood planks. I don't know where they came from, but there was also an assortment of sleds, long ones, sort of, they were called flyer sleds, and we used them all the time. They must
Flex.
As I guess the family grew, you went from a small sled to a big one, and the big one would seat four, or your belly was on for four, and steered it by the, what you call them, with your hand or your feet.
They were called flexible flux, right?
And Kinney Street, of course, was a hill, so we could do that with no problem at all. But everybody, when it snowed, the village would leave the snow there for a day, so that the whole village came out and sled, because we had lots of hills. So you could do sleigh riding, and we did that, and all the time. And we had this assortment of sleds. So that was a winter activity. Another thing was that, as I said, children went everywhere. Well, we went everywhere, but most children went everywhere, too, with their parents or family members. And what we didn't have in the village was a bank, and we didn't have a dentist. So we had to go either to Sparkhill for that or to Nyack. And we had an undertaker. I missed that, I think. There was an undertaker in town. But most of the wakes were held at home that I remember growing up. My grandmother was waked at home, and it was in February, and we had a big snowstorm during the time she was wakes were held like 2 or 3 days. And of course, you had to provide food, and it was just a whole different scenario. But anyway, the street department at that point, which we call the garbage men, came and they cleared Ash Street, and they cleared the way so that people could come to our home and visit, pay their respects. Another example of communal living, in my opinion.
Wow.
Yeah, wow is right.
Well, you're a great storyteller.
Oh, I don't know about that. I'm trying to tell you in little words, few words as I can, and organizing it.
Trains, churches, schools, industry.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot to tell you about the mill. Now, I was never in the mill in any shape or form. But there was I can't even describe it to you. My uncles all worked in the mill. And one uncle, I don't know whether he overslept or whatnot often, but we would come home from school for lunch break, and my grandmother would have his lunch ready, sandwiches and whatnot, and we had to go down to the mill part where he worked, which was an open platform kind of thing. You know where Flywheel Park is now? That was that part. That's an artifact of a piece that I guess they wanted to preserve or couldn't pick out or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it's still there, and that's the portion that I'm trying to think about. That's like an open platform with all these rail lines going in, and the freight cars all over the place. And we would bring his lunch. So I guess he knew we were coming. We didn't go into the mill at all. We just stayed outside until he arrived for his lunch. That was often. And then there was the part that I forgot to tell you about the mill. We experienced the sounds of fire whistles very, very often. And everybody, well, I don't know if everybody, we had a chart in our kitchen. And the signals, we knew by the signals of the mill whistles. The mill whistles were the fire whistles. And if it was 12, it was someplace else. If it was 41, it was someplace. So we knew where the fires were. And often they were in a big warehouse kind of thing the mill had, where they stored the paper that came by the freight. They baled and baled the paper, which I guess they converted to boxes, whatever you call that stuff that boxes are made out of.
Cardboard.
Okay, whatever. And it often caught fire. And we had one fire engine, which was inadequate for the task. And I think that a lot of these fires probably were from compaction by, what's that process called? Where they just catch fire from compression.
Oh, combustion?
Yeah, something like that. I forget. I knew it. It isn't something I use every day, so it doesn't come up too often. So then we would have all these ladder companies come in from out of town, Nyack being one, and they would try to put out these fires. Just kind of combustion. Well, anyway. So that was a part of, and we could see that from our house. And from the schoolyard, we could see it. So that was another sound that guided us. So we were kind of ordered our lives by sound. What train got us to school or to church or to bed. I mean, it was just a cacophony of all kinds of sounds that we grew up. And now that I'm looking back at it, so what did I leave out? Oh, yes, I left the parade. One of the parades that scared me was one that was led. It wasn't a regular parade. It was a parade of men dressed in, young men, dressed in work clothes. I'm not talking about overalls or anything, but they were, I think it was brown work clothes, which I later learned, and these men were not accompanied by any music or anything, but they were the WPA workers who built the park, Tallman Mountain State Park. And they came with shovels and picks and swords and hammers slung over their shoulders, like rifles. I mean, they were tools. And they were the ones later that I learned that built Tallman Mountain State Park, which became our summer haven because it had 2 pools. We learned to swim in the river very young. My grandmother tells us that she used to work at the resort there as I forget the name.
Comfort Inn?
What is it?
Not Comfort Inn.
Comfort Inn, yeah. No, yeah, Comfort Inn, that's right. I think that's the name of it. Anyway, what she did when I was at this resort stage, it was a very, I guess, I don't know if you call it exclusive, but certainly people from the city came. And she would wash the swimsuits that men and women wore in those days. Because I guess she didn't own her own suit. You kind of had to rent it or something. Anyway, she and her, sometimes friends who would work there. And then it had a little playground of swings and trapeze, and I guess a slide, and what's the thing that went up and down? Well, anyway, it was an assortment of things. So we spent a lot of time there. and they had a refreshment stand, and we would swim in the river. With no lifeguard, because it wasn't at the height of the season, so I don't know how we got there, but anyway, that's where we were. And that's where we learned to swim. We would swim out to a raft that was, well, quite far out, and we must have been all of 7 or something, 6 or 7. I don't think my grandmother worked there at that time, but she took us there to show us the beach. And it was a nice little beach, sand, very nice. And then later on in life, they had a dance pavilion there. And that was like in high school or young adulthood. And we would go there, and all the young people would be there doing their cheerleading and whatnot. So that's a part of communal life too. And from the church, I forgot to mention that Dr. Leitner, this one doctor we had in town, he would give a Christmas party for all of the children in church. Mm-hmm. And he probably gave it for every church, knowing that family. But it was given at the Knights of Columbus Hall on Tremont Avenue now, which is, I guess, I don't know if it's taken down or it's not used anymore, but it was a very active place. And he always had a magician. And we would be entertained by the magician, and then there was food and candy and stuff like that. So that was something we could look forward to every Christmas. He would do that. I'm probably forgetting a lot of things, or I can't put them into context now. And then, I know, after we learned to swim in the river, and we would then by ourselves walk, so we wouldn't have to be escorted, so to speak, by my grandmother or my mother or anybody like that. Then we got to go to the pools in the park. We would walk. That was a long walk from Ash Street, Piermont, all the way up to Tolman Mountain State Park. But they had 2 pools, and I remember what we called the baby pool. You could swim there till you were 8 years old. And after that, you would go into the big pool where they had a lifeguard and lockers, but you had to pay in the big pool. You didn't have to pay in the baby. So we spent a lot of our summers there and got to know people from other places, like Jersey and whatnot, that were not part of our Piermont group, so to speak. But they became our friends through the summer thing here. And then, well, anyway, so that's it. Let's see now. Oh, we went everywhere. Our world opened up to us in ways that seem kind of quaint now. Mm-hmm. But I can describe the age. It was an age of safety. And it was an age of predictability. Certain things happened at certain times. You knew they were going to happen. Mm. It's not like the frenzy that exists these days. I wonder how our nervous system keep up with it these days. Mm-hmm. But, it's the rapidity of everything. Mm. And the constant flow of things. But things were a little gentler then. And they were safe. We could go down the street and play for hours and know by the whistle what time we would have to be home, and nobody worried about us. We played with our friends. The sidewalks in Piermont in those days were chalked up with hopscotch things that the girls played. Nobody bothered about that. You were just part of the village. You couldn't do that now. Well, the village is an entirely different place. Wow. So we had a good childhood, but it was predictable in a way. Now, another thing that was predictable is that when you graduated from high school, you all your neighbors would come with baskets of flowers appeared on stage, when you were graduating. And this one belonged to this one belonged to that. Well, many times we would come home from these graduation ceremonies, whoever was graduating, and there would be flowers all over the place. I don't know where the florist was, but I believe there was a greenhouse in Asphalt Hill. I think it was called Jansen. And my grandmother loved flowers, so we always had flowers in the house. Whether it was homegrown or from florist. The other one, of course, was Vernon Church at night, but that came along later. So that was a part of life. But I also remember, this was part of my life, when one of my grandmother's friends gave me a $10 gold piece when I graduated from high school. I forgot about that gold piece because it meant nothing to me at that point in time. But years later, I discovered this, and about, I don't know how, but I took it to be appraised. That $10 gold piece was worth $200. Now, I can't tell you exactly when that was, but I'm guessing it might have been the 60s or the 70s. I don't have that gold piece anymore. I don't know where it went. But to me, it was amazing because where did they get the gold pieces? I mean, you had to go, we didn't have a bank. These were immigrant families. And they, unless gold was so much a part of their stability of life that they brought over from them, I don't know. But it still amazes me to this day.
Well, what I'd like to do is get you, since you have such an incredible recollection of your life and Piermont, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. I want to make sure that we have everything of good quality. It's just very valuable, content.
Well, you must be hearing the same stories from everybody.
Well, no, everybody, sees the world differently and has a different experience, and everybody has a little bit more detail. So you end up getting a full picture, even if, it's like looking at an object from all different directions, from north, south, east, west, above, below. You get a full picture. So this is very valuable. So we will try to get you some materials so that you can review it. And if you think about something that you don't think you covered, Lola and I will be in touch with you. So just let us know, and we can do another session. But this was just very, very, very valuable. Very fascinating to listen to, and you are a wonderful storyteller. And a couple times I could see all the clotheslines that we put in.
It was something that I tried to convey a spirit of Piermont.
You did a wonderful job, and the sounds that you said were that ordered the life of everyone who lived there. So I will be in touch with you shortly. I'm going to send you the release form.
Oh yes.
And then I will we'll be talking. It's wonderful.
Right. Now I don't know. What is your number?
I'll give you my phone number. Do you have a way of writing it? Write it down.
Yes.
Tell me when you're ready.
I'm ready.
845.
Yes.
675.
675.
3160.
3160.
And it's the Bill Batson. Bill, Billbatson.
Oh, it's 2 L's?
No, Bill, Bill, like, short for Bill.
B-I-L-L, and your last name is Batson?
Yeah, Batson.
Oh, Batson. Okay, I got it. Okay, I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it. It was very nice to meet you.
All right, well, I'm glad that I could put it together as much as I can.
It's wonderful. It's perfect.
The organ and organize it. I don't know if I've given everything on the railroad, but, I did this before for Lola.
It was
For
perfect.
the railroad, so these just additions that I have. So I don't know what she wants to do with them, but
It was absolutely perfect.
we asked me to put some in.
It was absolutely perfect. Thank you.
Okay, very good. All right, well, nice to talk to you.
I'll talk with you soon.
You must have a fascinating dog.
It's a fascinating life. And you're right.
That's true.
Got much more chaotic.
All right, okay. Bye-bye.
Hello.
I couldn't cut her off, I felt. Man, that was a marathon. Did back in the day when people had, like,